Hello, everyone, and welcome to our virtual Knowledge at Noon program. Knowledge at Noon is a free monthly speaker series featuring artists, historians, and agricultural professionals that explore themes central to YoloArts and Yolo County Historical Collections exhibitions at the Gibson House and Property. Today's talk will be given by artist Jane Ingram Allen, but before we get started, I wanted to share a few things that YoloArts is doing to bring arts to Yolo County during this time. New to our online galleries are Gallery 625's Ron Hall and Amy Green Rhythms, and our student show, The Beautiful Process. Still on view are Fashion Forward, Women's Wear and Social Reform, the Gallery at Dignity Health, and of course, the Women's Eco Artist Dialogue, The Legacy of Jo Hansen. Now I'm going to turn it over to YoloArts' Creative Director, Janice Purnell.
Thanks, Jenna. Welcome, everyone, and thank you all for being here today. And thank you, Jane, for putting together this talk on your fascinating paper-making process. We are so fortunate to be able to feature two artist talks by artists in our current exhibit at the Barn Gallery. Last month, we welcomed Judith Selby Lang, whose talk you can still view on our website. Women Eco Artist Dialogue, The Legacy of Jo Hansen, is now on view at the Barn Gallery and features 33 works of eco art by 16 artists from Northern California and across the country. All the pieces were selected from the WEAD artist membership and co-curated along with WEAD board member Nanette Wild. I highly recommend you to take a moment to view the work in our online gallery, along with a video by Tomas Montoya, who beautifully captures this exhibit, which addresses the most important and significant environmental issues of our time and honors the memory of WEAD co-founder Jo Hansen. And I'm happy to announce that we will soon be opening by appointment only next Thursday afternoons and every other Saturday afternoon starting on July 16th. Check our website for details, and we're working really hard to ensure that all Yolo County guidelines are in place for a safe visit. Thanks again, and back to you, Jenna.
Thank you, Janice. Of course, Knowledge at Noon isn't complete without a Q&A session with our speaker. So during today's presentation, feel free to submit a question using the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. During the session, I will monitor your questions and compile them later to discuss with our speaker. Jane Ingram Allen, originally from Alabama, lived in Taiwan from 2004 to 2012 before settling in Santa Rosa, California. She continues her career as an international artist using sustainable materials and collaborative processes to raise public awareness about environmental and social issues. She has received awards for her artist-in-residency projects in the US, the Philippines, Japan, Nepal, Brazil, China, Tanzania, Taiwan, Turkey, and Indonesia. Jane has been using hand paper making as part of her art process since 1982 to create indoor and outdoor public art installations. We are thrilled to have Jane here today. Jane, welcome.
Well, thank you. I'm welcoming everybody first, and it's so good to be able to do this Zoom program and tell you about my paper making and my handmade paper art experiences in some parts of the world. Okay, this program is about my art with handmade paper and goes through the process of making handmade paper and using local plants. This first slide is of my book that was a result of my Fulbright grant project in Taiwan. And this book has recipes for making paper from 135 different plants of Taiwan. And you know, since my artwork usually begins with creating handmade paper, I thought first I would go through the process of how paper is made and how to use local plant materials. And so I'll just go ahead and start that process. The first step, of course, is gathering some plant material. And you can use the bark or the leaves of certain plants. And you can use green or freshly trimmed, or you can use dried materials. And people always wonder what's the best plant for paper making. And, you know, everybody would probably give you a different opinion about that. But one of the ones that I really like, and that was very common in Taiwan, is paper mulberry. And the paper mulberry tree's bark is one of the best, and it's what the Japanese call kozo. And, you know, the Latin name is Brucinetta papyrifera. I've learned a lot about plants, and, you know, we always use the Latin name that scientists all over the world can understand. Okay, the second step after you've gathered the material is to prepare it. And, you know, you cut up the leaves and you take off the bark. Here you can see I'm doing some of that in Taiwan in 2004, 2005. And, you know, once you've taken the material, you cut it up into pieces so it'll fit easily in your pot. And usually I soak it in a bucket overnight. You know, just fill a bucket with water and put the material you're going to prepare in that. And then the next step is cooking the plant fibers. And you cook it in a caustic soda or a very strong alkaline. And you just have enough water to cover the material. And you should use rubber gloves when you're using the alkaline, and a stainless steel or enamel pot to cook it in. And after it comes to a boil, you turn it to simmer, and usually, you know, 3 or 4 hours. And you can take out a small amount and test it by beating it, see if it's cooked enough. After it's cooked, the next step is washing out the alkaline. And you can see here I have a sort of improvised strainer with a plastic laundry basket and a piece of window screening, and using the hose to wash this cooked plant material. After you've washed it, you don't need to wear the gloves anymore, and it can be handled with no problem. And then the next step is beating it. And you probably heard the expression, beat it to a pulp. That comes from the papermaking process. And usually you want to use a wooden platform to beat on, and use a wooden hammer or mallet. And you beat it out to sort of like a pancake, and then you gather it up, turn it over, and beat it out again. And the beating process is very important to make good paper. And this plant here is something we call snake plant, and it's the leaves of it. And you can see it's a pretty coarse fiber. Usually after you've beaten it by hand for a while, I put it in the kitchen blender. And I always carry the blender in my suitcase with me wherever I go around the world. And you want to use a blender that's strong enough to crush ice. If it can crush ice, it can usually make good pulp. And you know, you just put it in there with lots of water and blend it for about 30 seconds. And then the next step is pouring the pulp into the vat. And usually the vat is something like a plastic storage bin. And you can usually find these anywhere. And you need one that's deep enough and big enough that you can dip your mold into it easily and have enough room to move your screen about a bit. And usually if you have more pulp and less water, you will make thicker paper, but that's variable. You can, you know, add more water or add more pulp. And then it also depends on how you form the sheet. And I usually use formation aid, and formation aid is a natural material, although now most paper makers use the synthetic powder formation aid. And the roots of a type of hibiscus are used for formation aid. The slippery elm tree bark also makes formation aid. And one thing that we have here in warm climates is the plant okra, which is a vegetable that we eat. And you know, if you cook okra and strain the juice, it makes a very slimy liquid. And the formation aid makes the fibers stay suspended in the tub, and it also makes the water drain slowly. It makes it possible to do multiple dips and build a very thin but strong piece of paper. And here I'm making a sheet of paper in my rooftop studio in Taipei in 2005. And you can see the city of Taipei in the background. I found this was the best place to make paper, and it could run off easily on the floor there with no problem. And the mold is a wooden frame with some screening stretched across it tightly. And the decal is the extra wooden frame that goes on top to control the edges in the traditional sheet making process. And then the next step is taking the paper off the screen and transferring it onto a piece of fabric underneath. And here I'm doing the couching, we call it. And couching is a really paper-making word. Paper-making has its own little vocabulary, words like decal and couching. And when you take it off the screen, I use non-woven interfacing to put it on. It's inexpensive and it's smooth and it dries quickly. And here you can see I'm lifting up the screen after it's couched onto the non-woven interfacing fabric. And you lift it up carefully, and then after the paper is off the mold, you can use it again to form the next sheet. And there are many ways of drying the handmade paper. I use this way usually. Just put up a clothesline and pin the sheets of interfacing fabric onto the clothesline with the handmade paper sheet on it. And you know, sometimes paper makers make a stack and put it in a press of some sort and then paint the wet paper onto a shiny board or windows to dry. And after the handmade paper is dry, I take it off the clothesline and then peel the paper off the fabric. And you can see a piece in process in this picture. And this paper has no coatings or anything on it, but it's ready to use as it is. And you could iron it if you wanted to make it flatter. And so now I'm going to show you a few things that I've made with this handmade paper in my travels around the world in, you know, several of the residencies that I've done. And the first part here is about my Made in Taiwan project that I did as a Fulbright scholar in Taiwan in 2004 and 2005. And for this project, I traveled to 14 different communities in different parts of the island of Taiwan. And on the left-hand side here, you can see the Taiwan site maps. These are in the shape of the whole island of Taiwan. And this slide shows them hanging in an exhibition at the Suho Paper Museum in Taipei. And these are two-sided, and they fold up like maps. The pieces of paper are joined with threads, and they're mixed media. They have some acrylic paint, some collage, some pictures from tourist brochures, some natural materials like leaves and petals. And then on the right-hand side, you see a slide. When I was going around Taiwan doing this project, I would go to a different community and hang up the Taiwan site maps and keep adding to it. In each place, I would make a map of that county or city or part of Taiwan. And this slide shows, I thought it was interesting because the people are doing, I think, Tai Chi in the gallery where the exhibition is hanging. And during my Fulbright grant, I taught lots of people in Taiwan how to make paper. Sometimes I would do the setup for paper making right in the lobby of a museum. And also sometimes a whole classroom would come to my studio and get the opportunity to learn how to make paper. When I went to Taiwan, you know, it's a Chinese heritage country, and I thought, you know, since the Chinese invented paper, they would all know how to make paper, but I found it wasn't very common in these times. Most of the artists are wanting to do video and highly technical art, but they enjoyed the paper making. It's a really good way of connecting to nature and connecting directly to the place. And one of the things I did during my grant project in the city of Taipei, I found that they had very unique and interesting manhole covers. And so I would make a stack of paper in my studio and then take it out onto the streets and find a really good manhole cover and put the wet handmade paper on the manhole cover, and you brush it into it, and then you get like an embossment when it dries, and you peel it off the metal manhole cover. You can see on the left side there are 3 gentlemen there just very curious what I'm doing. And so I had the museum that was my host in Taipei make a sign that said "Artist at Work" and explain a little bit about what I was doing. And so, you know, you could leave it there on the street a little while, go have some coffee at a nearby coffee shop, and then come back in a few hours. And it dries really quickly on the metal manhole covers. And these are some of the Taiwan site maps I've made during that project. On the left is the county of Jiayi, which is in the central part of Taiwan. And you can see it's made up of many different sheets, and each of those sheets is a paper made with a different plant from that county. And I also use sometimes, you know, real leaves and real flower petals, and sometimes painted or collaged elements in it. And on the right-hand side is a map of the island of Kinmen, which is off the coast of Taiwan, very near mainland China. And it's actually made up of 2 islands. The one that's like the blue butterfly shape is the main island of Kinmen, and then the yellow flower is called Little Kinmen. And on the other side of this, it's more like a geographic map of the 2 islands. And this slide shows you how they look hanging in space. You know, they're joined by thread, so all of my site maps can fold up into, you know, like a 8.5 by 11 or an A4 size sheet of paper. So they're easy to transport and easy to store and carry with you when you're traveling around the country. During my Fulbright years, I also did a few public art projects, and this was one that was done on Earth Day in 2004 at a park in the city of Taipei. And I called it the Blue River Project, and I was trying to draw attention to the problem of pollution in rivers and, you know, keeping fresh water sources clean and pure. So that's why I dyed this pulp blue. And I had seeds for blue wildflowers in the pulp. And on Earth Day, invited everybody to come out and help pour this map of the river, the Xindian River, which is right by this park in Taipei. And you can see a few weeks later, the blue wildflowers were starting to bloom, and just about all the paper pulp had dissolved into mulch. And this was my idea with these projects. They use paper pulp and seeds to, you know, make it beautiful when it's first installed, and then transform over time into a living, blooming artwork that will continue to change. This one, unfortunately, met a very sad demise because the people who take care of that park had no idea this was an artwork, and they came in one Monday morning early and mowed the whole field. And so the blue flowers, we got a few pictures of them just beginning to bloom, but they never bloomed very much after it was mowed. And from this, I learned that in public art installations, it's very important to put out signs and to let the public and the people who work there know that this is an art book. This is another public art installation I did in Taiwan at Guangdu Nature Park, which is a nature park just outside Taipei. And I set up the paper making so that the public could participate. And in this pulp, I made it from the local plants, and I put seeds to feed the birds in it. And you can see the guy on the right is putting up his wet sheet of handmade paper onto a sort of nest shape that I had constructed with fallen branches. And I made 3 of these nests, and you could go inside them, and they became sort of like a bird blind because all the birds were coming to the nest to get some of the bird seeds, and you could sort of hide in there behind the handmade paper and look out and see the birds. And so this again was using the biodegradable property of handmade paper, and you know, it was constantly changing over the time. We would make new sheets of handmade paper and keep putting it on there. This is another installation I did in Taiwan at the National Taipei University of the Arts. And I worked with the students there. They collected plastic water bottles all over campus. And you know, Taiwan is like a lot of places in the world now. You can't drink the tap water, so they use a lot of plastic bottles. And I also wanted to bring attention to the plastic waste problem as well as the problems of, you know, clean, pure water. And so we cast all of these different handmade paper bottles with blue pulp that had seeds for blue wildflowers in it. And each of the students designed a unique label. You can see a close-up of one of the water bottles there, and the label they designed was supposed to, you know, say something about the water problem or the plastic waste problem. And I exhibited this in Taiwan and also in New York later, and you know, talked about the Pacific gyre. I know your last speaker, she also talked about that problem. This is one other public art project in Taiwan that I did at a university in Jiayi in the central part of Taiwan. And you can see the students here. I'm talking about how you make paper and how you make it from the local plant materials, and some of the students making paper on the right-hand side. And I call this project Healing the Earth, and it was composed of over 250 handmade paper prayer flags that I created with the students. And here you can see one of the students hanging his prayer flag up to dry. That was the year of the horse in Taiwan. And so we used some horse images. We also used pineapple images and leaves and flowers and birds. And the prayer flags, you know, I had experienced in Nepal as well as in Taiwan and in Japan. And they are always made in a certain color order. And, you know, blue, white, red, yellow, green. And this tub of pulp on the right-hand side is dyed with some non-toxic red dye. And the tubs of pulp had seeds for wildflowers in the same color. And here we are assembling the prayer flags, and we made like a casing in the top of each prayer flag, and I used a natural sisal rope to string, you know, about 30 handmade paper prayer flags in the blue, white, red, green, yellow, blue, white, red, green, yellow sequence. And here you can see I'm working with the students and doing some research on the computer about prayer flags and understanding you know, the whole meaning of the prayer flags. And for this installation, it was really interesting for me because I coordinated it with a local feng shui master. And most of you probably are familiar with feng shui. It's a belief about how you organize your space and how you use your space, and has spiritual meaning. And the idea with this project, the campus of this university was built so that the main road into the campus divided the earth. It sort of split apart a very beautiful ridge. And so the feng shui master and I thought it would be really a way of healing this rift in the earth to have handmade paper prayer flags with seeds in them for wildflowers coming down from the top of the ridge to sort of join it together again in a symbolic way. And we also planted some new trees to grow up and also help to heal this rift in the earth. So it was a really interesting opportunity for me as a foreign artist to learn more about the culture of Taiwan and feng shui. And even though we didn't speak the same language, we were able to communicate and to work together to do this project. And here's a detail of that installation. It was beautiful when it was first installed, and then they gradually dissolved into compost and went down to the earth, and the seeds, made wildflowers in the fields nearby. And this next group is about my residency in Tanzania, which is in West Africa. And I went there in 2008 during the month of January and February. And I got a grant from this really interesting foundation in Kansas City that likes to promote international artist exchange. And here you can see some photos of working there with the local people. The one on the top right, it is in the local market. When I went there, I was trying to find a good cooking pot to make to cook the plant materials in. And I said, you want to use stainless steel or enamel. In the market, they only had big tin pots. So I wasn't able to find a pot there. And on the left-hand side, you can see I'm beating some of the pulp and using just a wooden bench to beat the pulp that's already been cooked and washed. And on the right-hand side, in the bottom, I did make a really big paper making mold so we could make some big sheets in just a simple frame with some screening stretched over it here. And Tanzania had a lot of different plants, some that we had used in Taiwan. They also had a kind of mulberry. And you can see here, one of the volunteers is helping to pick some mulberry branches to get the bark. And on the right-hand side, I'm working on a site map using some of the handmade paper that I made in Tanzania. And I told you I couldn't find a good cooking pot in the market. And this shows I was making or cooking the pulp in a half of an oil barrel. It was just a metal oil barrel that we cut in half. And we had to do the cooking by making a wood fire. Electricity is very expensive. And, also water is very scarce in Tanzania. So I learned to recycle a lot of the water in the paper making process. And the tubs I found there were mostly round plastic wash tubs. So I had to adapt the paper making to use a round tub instead of the rectangular tubs I was used to using. And during the time I was there in Tanzania, sometimes they would have groups of students or groups of other artists come in to make paper and learn the whole process with me. And these are some of the works I made in Tanzania. I was making site maps. The one on the left is the whole country of Tanzania. And on this side, I put some of the wildlife and the people and the culture. And you can see it's made of many sheets of paper joined with thread, and it's in the shape of the country of Tanzania. And the map on the right side is a map of the city of Arusha, and that's where I was working. Arusha is a really beautiful city, very near Mount Kilimanjaro. In fact, you could see the top of Mount Kilimanjaro every day when you were working in the studio. And Tanzania is really an interesting place. Of course, you can see lots of wildlife there. And this is an elephant on the left side, of course. It was just walking right down the street, very close to our safari jeep in one of the national parks. And we also visited some Maasai warrior villages. And these are the villagers that came out to greet us when we went there. I stayed in Taiwan for several years after the Fulbright, also did projects with many different organizations all over Taiwan. In August 2012, my husband and I moved back to the US, and we decided to settle in Santa Rosa. And I've done since then projects in Taiwan and other countries, and many projects in this local area. And in 2015, I got another Fulbright grant to go to the country of Turkey and to the city of Izmir. And there I was making paper from the local plants and did a site map installation. On the right-hand side, you can see the Izmir city site map that I made. And here I'm doing a workshop with the local art teachers to teach them how to make paper from the local plant materials. Okay. And this is one of the projects I've done in California. It was also a grant project, this time from WEAD, the Women Eco-Artist Dialogue, which also is a sponsor of the exhibit at YoloArts. And there I was an artist in residence for a month or so at the Museum of Art and History in Lancaster. And Lancaster is still in LA County, but it's in a beautiful area where they have lots of fields in the springtime with many, many golden poppies. So for this project, I decided to make a handmade paper quilt. And this is a sketch of it here, and use the poppy motif and blue pulp and the yellow-orange pulp with white borders and a white square in the middle. And I worked with people in the community, and these are some of the squares. We're putting it down on the prepared bed. And the idea is for the paper pulp to dissolve into compost and disappear, and the seeds to sprout and grow and bloom in the same colors and pattern. And for each of the beds, you know, I literally make a flower bed. I make a headboard and footboard of local branches in a sort of basket weaving technique. Right. And this is another quilt project in the city of Newnan, Georgia, which is just outside of Atlanta. And that city is known as the city of homes. And so I used a quilt pattern that was like a southern mansion in the colors of red, yellow, blue, and white. And this pulp has seeds for wildflowers in it, and the headboard and footboard made of local branches. And here you can see we put hydrangea blossoms, dried hydrangea blossoms, because they were all over at that time in the city of Newnan. Here's a close-up of the quilt. We staked it down so that the parts of the quilt wouldn't blow away, hopefully, until they had sunk into the earth more and started to sprout. And there I had public participation activities, sort of open studio, where people could come in anytime and learn to make paper and make parts of the quilt for the public art installation. And in this slide, you can see it's starting to change. Some of those seeds are sprouting and coming up, and the paper pulp is dissolving. And then on the right side, the blooms are beginning. It was installed the last day of August, and by the 1st of November, we were getting some blooms. And this quilt has been left. It was put on the grounds of a local children's museum. And so they just left it, and it came back every spring with new flowers. And the headboard and footboard lasted for 2 years, and then it finally disappeared, or, they took it down and it went back to the earth. And this is the quilt in 2020. In April, and many red poppies are blooming this year. And if you look on my blog, you can see there's a really interesting article in the local paper, the Noonan, Georgia newspaper, telling the story of these red poppy seeds that are now coming back every year in this quilt. And this is the project I did in Santa Rosa with making a living quilt. And this was a fire response proposal. In the slide on the left, it's not very clear, but maybe you can tell that this is in one of the areas of Santa Rosa that was badly hurt by the wildfires in October 2017. And the quilt pattern used here is one called wild geese or flying geese. And again, I used the red, yellow poppies, the California poppies in the gold color, and blue wildflowers, California bluebells, and then a white flower we call baby's breath in the white parts of the quilt. And over here on the right, you can see it's also starting to transform. And I like, how it looks in all its phases when it's first put out, and then as it transforms over time. And this is how it looked in 2019. Many of the blue flowers blooming and a few poppies still blooming. And then this is how it looks in the spring of 2020. Some of the white flowers, the blue ones bloom a little bit later. So these projects are always interesting if they are, left for several years. Some of the flower seeds are annuals and some are perennials, so it comes back and keeps changing. And this is a project I did in Sacramento last year with a school, Thomas Charter School. It's the School of the Arts for high schoolers in Sacramento. And this is a sketch. I used a gun theme. I was wanting to talk to the students about gun violence. And this was a non-threatening way and allowed them to, address this issue, which has become, such a big problem in America. And so we made a quilt that had guns that were going to transform into flowers over time. And, I worked with the kids in the art classroom, and we made the squares for the quilt. We made 20 each inch squares. And you can see on the right-hand side, the kids are hanging some of them on the clothesline to dry. And on installation day, the students participated and helped lay it out on the ground that was prepared and had the soil leveled out. And we had already woven the headboard and the footboard of the bed. So on the right-hand side, you see the quilt, how it looked when it was installed March 16th, 2019. And this is in May 2019. You can see some of the flowers are coming up, and you can still see some of the paper dissolving into compost. And this is how it looks this year in April. Many white flowers coming up and blooming, and a few blue ones and red ones and other colors. And it'll continue to change and bloom. They made a sprinkler so that it would get water. You know, in Sacramento, getting enough water in the summer is a real challenge. And so this sort of concludes the program. The returning to the show here in YoloArts at the Barn Gallery. And here I'm installing my indoor piece, California Delta Rivers. And this piece is made with blue handmade paper that's from recycled blue jeans. And I was looking at maps of the rivers in the Delta. So this map only has rivers, there's no land. And every time I install it in a different place, it's a little bit different. And on the right-hand side, you can see how it looks in the gallery. This was an interesting place to put it because it goes around a corner. Because the sheets of handmade paper are joined with thread, it can bend in many different ways. And then this is the flower power installation outdoors at the YoloArts Barn Gallery. And here I used again the issue of gun violence to sort of make the people more aware of this. And I made handmade paper guns in these different colors, and they have seeds for wildflowers in the same colors. And this is how it transforms over time. That's in April of this year, and then in June. Okay. Thank you very much. And I'd just like to say my next project will be in Sacramento, and hopefully in October, November, we'll be able to go and work in the community. If not, I will just plan to make it myself and do virtual programs. So now I'd like to turn it over to Jenna again, and she's going to coordinate any questions that people might have.
Thank you so much, Jane. That was so interesting. Just a reminder, everyone, please feel free to submit your questions via chat at the bottom of your screen. First one coming in, yes, this talk will be archived. It is being recorded, and we will make it available on the YoloArts page on our website and on our YouTube channel. So it'll probably be sometime tomorrow, by the end of day tomorrow. One of the first questions that I do have coming in is just in terms of materials, Jane. So kind of a broad question, can you make paper out of any type of plants? Are there any plants that you don't recommend? And what is maybe the most unique source that or material you've used in making paper?
Well, I think that's a very good question. You know, every plant has some fiber in it, and that's what you want, but some have more fiber than others. And you know, if you're familiar with cooking and eating, we talk about high fiber plants, and I think many of the ones we use for eating would make good paper too, and I have used a few of those. And I've only found, I guess, maybe 2 or 3 plants in all the ones I've tried around the world that didn't make paper, and one was a kind of seaweed, and one was a kind of mushroom, and they just kind of all clumped together and, you know, didn't make any kind of sheet. You know, sometimes the paper will be like this is a piece of paper that was made from, I think, the stems of cosmos flowers, and it's very coarse fiber and, you know, has tiny holes in it. So it might not be something you'd want to use for drawing or painting on, but I use these in my maps. They're really interesting and unique. And then others, you know, can be very smooth. This is cedar bark paper. And you could use that to paint on a drawing. And, sometimes the color is more white naturally. Of course, you can bleach any of the pulps to make them white, but bleaching is one of the things that's very bad for the environment. And so I don't do any except a few times I've tried natural bleaching with lemon juice and putting it in the sun, and that works pretty well. But yeah, you can make paper from anything just about, but some are much better than others. And in doing this, I've learned the plant families and learned a lot about botany. And I know which ones, and I can usually pick off a leaf and tear it apart. And if you can see little fibers in it, it might make some kind of paper. Okay.
So on a similar vein, we have a question from Natasha asking about what types of non-toxic dyes do you use?
I used to use Createx dyes. I've also used Procyon dyes. And right now I'm using some from Dharma Trading Company, which is, very near us here in Northern California. And, it's a cold water dye, which is good for, trying to dye pulp. And you can also use pigment to color pulp. And I told you I use blue jeans, and I get the blue jean pulp from a papermaking supplier in Brooklyn because I don't have one of those big Hollander beater machines. And it's really hard to process, like tough blue jean fiber by hand. And so I just order the pulp, and it's a natural indigo color blue. And, the dye I use, it works all right with the seeds. It doesn't hurt them, and it doesn't hurt the earth. And, the water is okay to pour out. So, I try to do everything in a way that will not cause more harm to the earth and hopefully improve it a bit.
Excellent. We have a lot of very interested people in materials today. So in terms of fibers, have you worked with...
artists, I think.
Yes, definitely. Have you worked with artichoke plants or with bamboo leaves at all?
Yes, I have. I've used bamboo leaves a lot. That's one of the best plants in Taiwan. And it's bamboo paper is what they use to burn in the temples as spirit paper. And the leaves of bamboo have very short fibers. The pieces of bamboo have much better fiber, but it takes a long time to make paper from them, about a year. And they usually red it outside in big pits and put, lime in it for the alkaline. So I was using bamboo leaves, and, any long leaf plant, like iris leaves, daylily leaves, and so on, will make paper. And so I thought, well, maybe bamboo leaves will do something, but it's pretty short fiber, and the fiber was kind of weak. But I, added some mulberry bark in with it, and it made really interesting paper. And the paper was kind of green when you use the green bamboo leaves. And artichokes, they're really kind of hard to use, to get enough fiber. And I've used the, after the artichoke and the flower dries, I've used just those pieces, that you can pick off and put it in the pulp, just scatter it in the pulp. But usually it's with some other pulp. Okay.
Sure. A question about formation aid from Jim. He's wondering, have you ever used aloe or something similar? And he's wondering about the quality, if it has the similar quality that you would need.
To make formation aid, you need a substance that will make a stream when you lift it up. I don't know, you couldn't probably see it in that picture I was putting the formation aid in, but it just kind of makes a continuous stream when you pour it out. And aloe seems like it would work, and I did actually try it when I was in Taipei, because they had a lot of aloe plants, but it doesn't have that property of making a continuous stream and making the fibers suspend evenly and making it possible to go in and do multiple dips. But okra is very good. I used it in my residency in Brazil because they had a lot of okra. And I went to the market and just got a bunch of okra and cooked it for a little bit, and then strained it through a nylon stocking. And it was kind of green slime instead of the clear stuff, you get from some of the other plants.
Wonderful. Tina is asking, if you have very limited supplies and access to equipment, what is the bare minimum that is needed to do projects with students?
Just a frame and a piece of screening on it. And, sometimes I've used like embroidery hoops. You can get a round embroidery hoop and just stretch some screen cloth over it and then use that as a mold, and you just make round paper. Or, if you have some old picture frames from a Goodwill store or something, you can stretch screening over it and use that. And there are some screenings that are better than others. Like fiberglass screen cloth is pretty coarse, and the paper will not be as smooth or fine, but you can use that. And from the papermaking suppliers, you can buy a very fine woven mesh screening. Actually, in Taiwan, they had really fine screening because they have so many, no-seums, we call them, that go through some of the normal window screenings. So they have a lot of different screening. And one time, it was interesting to me in England. I went there to do a project, and I thought, no problem to find window screening, but they don't even use window screening in England because I guess they don't have a problem with the insects coming inside when they open the windows.
Interesting. I would have never thought about that.
Yeah, I never did either. But I had to order some from somebody in America when I was in England. Yeah.
Jonathan is curious about how your work interacts with local ecologies, especially for your installations in outdoor sites. What kinds of things do you consider when creating a work that is meant to transform and grow along with its environment?
Well, I always try to use native plants, and I work with a very good wildflower seed company usually, and it's called American Meadows. You can go to americanmeadows.com. And they have blends of native wildflower seeds. And, I read as much as I can about them, and also talk to local gardening people. And, there are master gardeners groups all over, and, people who study plants. And so I try to get native plants if it's going to be anything that is perennial or will come back every year. And if I'm looking for some flower that will just make a certain color and bloom at a certain time and be a certain height, I sometimes use annuals that, don't come back and will just disappear after one season. But I think it's very important not to, introduce invasive plants. And in some places I've worked with national parks and actually made paper from only invasive plants. And that's a very interesting thing to do, to bring attention to, these plants that have been brought in from somewhere else and have become invasive and wiping out the native plants. It's a good issue to bring up.
Excellent, yes. We have a question here. First, hoping that you will be bringing a piece to Switzerland soon. But in the thought about plants, what about corn? It seems like that's cultivated in many areas, and different leaves of trees.
Yeah, corn is actually a very good plant. Corn, I've used corn leaves and stalks, and it makes a very nice paper, and it's kind of a yellowish light tan color and has sort of a coarse texture. But corn leaves or stalks are useful for paper making. And I think a lot of agricultural waste is good for paper making. I've used pineapple plants, pineapple leaves, because they just leave those usually. And as I mentioned, banana leaves of all kinds are good for paper making.
Wonderful. Elena is wondering, what are the aspects of the papermaking process that are so engaging for project participants? She's really thinking about the socially engaged aspect of your work.
Well, as I mentioned, it's like playing in the water, and kids really love it, but I found people of all ages like it. You know, I enjoy the sounds of it, you know, the water dripping through the screen back into the tub. Um, and it's a fun activity, and it's not one that requires, you know, things like drawing skills usually. It's a much more hands-on kind of activity that anybody can do. And I've taught it to kids as young as two or three. And, you know, I've also worked in old folks' homes, we call them. That's not a politically correct term, but, you know, with the elderly, and they enjoyed it too. It's, I think, very engaging to people and very satisfying. And it's, we have an old Southern expression my mother used to use all the time: making something from nothing, making something from nothing. And so it's kind of like that. You know, it's always surprising and fun to see, you know, what kind of paper you can make from this plant.
Wonderful. Typically, about how long are the sessions when you're working with the volunteers?
Usually at least 2 hours, but sometimes after I have it all set up, people can just come in and, you know, make a sheet of paper and, you know, stay 10 or 15 minutes. But if they really get into it, they, you know, stay longer. And, you know, for a workshop to go through the whole process, starting from gathering the plants, it's usually a 2-day workshop, because the first day you're gathering and cooking and maybe beating, and then the second day you're able to make paper from the plants you cooked up.
Wonderful. Well, we're getting close on our time here. So
Yeah.
my final question today would be, do you have any advice for artists who are interested in international residencies? Of course, right now isn't necessarily the best time for those types of adventures, but when it is safe to travel again, what would you advise people?
Well, I think use your contacts. If you know any artists who are from other countries that you want to go to, or if you know any artists in those countries, to contact them and say, you know, where would be a place that would offer a residency? And of course, there are websites like Res Artists and Trans Artists, and many different places you can look on the internet. But I would say target a particular country. And of course, I think the Fulbright grant and the Fulbright program is wonderful. And artists don't even think about the Fulbright usually, but they give Fulbrights to professional artists as well as to academics. And, you know, when I applied for the Fulbright, I think there were 3 countries in the world that would take an artist, and Taiwan was one of them. And I didn't know anything about Taiwan, but I said, well, it's in Asia. They must know or have some paper making there. So, you know, I think doing research and, you know, using your contacts is the best way. And I try to find ones that will, you know, give grants of some kind. And I mentioned the place in Kansas City is Lighton International Artist Exchange Program. If you have a residency and they're not paying you for your airfare, then you could apply for that grant. So,
Wonderful. Thank you.
all right.
So really quick, we just want to thank everyone for logging on and for joining us today. Here on the screen is a link to Jane's blog, where you can stay up to date on all of her projects, janeingramallen.wordpress.com. A reminder again, the WEAD show is up in the Barn Gallery through August 22nd. We are open finally for gallery hours by appointment only. So please make it a point to get in and see the beautiful show. Email jpurnell@YoloArts.org to schedule your visit. And of course, follow us on social media at YoloArtsCA on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with what YoloArts is doing. Thank you guys so much for coming on, for making this such a great dialogue with Jane, and thank you all. We look forward to seeing you again in August.
Thanks, everyone.